Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. And so, in today's video, I want to talk about how major cities and urban centers are designed to be poverty traps. Because I was going out for a drive with my wife the other day, actually several months ago, to be honest. I'm kind of recycling a story that for a conversation that we had maybe almost half a year ago at that point. But here's the thing. Something I've continuously noticed as time has gone on. Okay, you're probably all aware the common cultural trend is that everybody wants to be country these days. Now, obviously, that's not too far or even derivative from the concept of American frontierism, nor is it a new concept. But I want to talk about the economic dynamics and the class dynamics of why the wealthy retreat to the countryside and how cities end up being centers of immense amounts of poverty. Okay, I want to talk about the class dynamics of that, because it's something that I've noticed is that there's a lot of people who mock people who live in the big city, even though literally 80% of people live in the big city, for being poor, for, being in a situation that they don't have much of a control of, okay? And that's kind of an interesting thing. It's an interesting dynamic is because most people don't consider it to be a privilege to live in a place where you're renting an apartment that's under 600 square feet for $3,000 a month. In fact, everybody tells you to move to the countryside is because it's easier. I mean, it's pretty obvious that country life tends to be better is because you're not so tightly packed on a single space. There's even a video called Liberalism and Mental Disorder that describes that cities are the prime reason why people have such large amounts of mental illnesses in major cities, because people are so tightly confined to each other. Now, whether or not that's true is not really relevant to the topic of the video, but the thing is that everybody knows that cities just objectively suck. Okay? Nobody wants to live in them. Everybody wants to LARP his country, especially nowadays. Okay? And it's kind of funny that, I've always heard these arguments from third worldists and people, who like to antagonize the Western working class. And they always point to the nominal salaries that people make in the United States as an example of why the first world worker is so incredibly privileged. But we all know intuitively, and this is the purchasing power gaslights argument, is because the logic goes as follows, okay? Is because hypothetically, when you make a nominally high salary in the city, you can currency exchange it and go live like a king in another country. That is the hypothetical, privilege that so many people who are third worldists, and I would even argue ruling class members in the American state like to argue that the American worker has, is because they're nominally higher salaries, highest in the world, they can hypothetically take their currency to another country and live like a king. And that's kind of the funny part, okay? Most people will, it is a common cultural trend that most people say that this is evidence of the American worker being such a privileged, worker of the rest of the world is because of this exclusive hypothetical. But intuitively, deep down that just because somebody is living in the city, hypothetically, they might make $200K, but that doesn't carry them very far is because rent for an average studio is $3,000 a month and the cost of living is generally higher. And people intuitively know that, and that's why they want to live in the countryside. And it's almost one of the most disingenuous arguments I've ever heard done against the American working class that I have yet to hear a single person speak out against this, is because it's just kind of taken as axiomatically true. It always gets, spun up every once in a while. The propaganda apparatus of either the Democrat or the Republican Party spins up this narrative using the purchasing power gaslights argument to say that the American worker is privileged and that they have no reason to complain or even protest about their declining standard of living or BlackRock buying up all these neighborhoods. Okay? Which is ironic is because we all know intuitively that nobody wants to live in the city. As a culture, we all want to live in the countryside is because that seems to be where things are cheaper, and also, on top of that, it's overall healthier. You're not so close within proximity to a bunch of people. You don't have to deal with the over-socialized nature of humanity when you have your own private space and private quarters to just ultimately be left alone. But the funny part is, for some deranged reason, when it comes to the American worker, which is literally the same argument, is that this is a privilege for the American worker on a global stage, but then we pretend it's a different set of circumstances when people move out of the city into the domestic countryside. But when people move on the global countryside, this is evidence of the privilege of the American worker, even though literally nobody in our culture glorifies living in the city anymore. It may be 20 years ago, it was kind of the craze, because I remember that as a kid. As a kid, I wanted to move to the city because I thought it was a neat thing, and I was from the countryside, and I just never knew what it was like until I actually moved there for college, and it smelled like, you know, human shit and gasoline everywhere. So it wasn't exactly a pleasant experience, because our cities are not designed for human life. It's designed to maximize profit, to get people into these cubicle farms where they can have their soul sucked away for 8 hours a day until the weekend, and then spend an hour both ways commuting in traffic. But in nobody's brain is this lifestyle considered a privilege to anybody. But when it comes to the global stage, you know, economists and bourgeois plutocrats will definitely tell American workers that they're privileged because of this dynamic, because of this hypothetical. The same hypothetical that if you took all that money, you could live like a king in the countryside as well. Which brings us to an interesting dynamic that the ruling class also likes to tacitly ignore while they call American workers in these major urban centers, which are effectively poverty traps, privilege, is that when they say that hypothetically you can take your dollars out of the United States and live like a king, they're more or less speaking on behalf of themselves, is because if you're a part of the wealthy asset class where you have a ton of money and you can't afford to go out of the city, then yeah, you can live this hypothetical and live like a king. You can live like you can live in a mansion. I've talked about this plenty of times. If you want to build wealth, as one possible strategy. Now, obviously, this is a big hypothetical, is because, again, big hypothetical, don't take it with take this with a grain of salt, is that if you move to the big city and you get a high enough paying job where you can own property and build wealth, yes, you could sell your 1,000 square foot 2-bed house for $1 million in San Francisco, California, and then go in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and live like a king, buy a mansion for $400K, and then still have enough money left over to like live the rest of your days like semi-comfortable, okay? Right? So that is the privilege that the American ruling class doesn't like to admit, is because when they speak of this hypothetical, they're only speaking of themselves because they have the money to facilitate this possibility in the first place. They have the money to go to the countryside to live like the kings they claim the American worker can, but they can't, which is ironic, is because they know that they can. It's because just recently they've been doing a major push to return to the office for the vast majority of people, is because when they had a whole bunch of remote workers, it drives up demand for countryside properties, and that's driving up asset prices. This is the double standard of privilege that the American worker has to deal with, but the American ruling class gets to enjoy, is that the American worker has to get paid shit wages to live in highly compact, highly dense urban centers, living in 500 square foot, area, apartments, paying $3,000 a month, while members of the ruling class and the asset class can quite literally buy big mansions that are under 500K, that are 4,000 square foot in the countryside, because they're a part of the asset class and they have remote work perms and they don't have to show up to the office, and they have private jets. They can move out to the countryside and take advantage of the lower prices, while everybody else who is working harder, getting paid less, has to pay the higher prices in the major urban centers. That's the secret that a lot of people who are pro-country, who tell everybody that they're country, don't like to admit, is because the people who are country don't actually, they live there. Now, don't get me wrong. Now, if you're somebody who commutes into the city because, you have a job in there and you're just going out into the suburbs to live out there, that doesn't really qualify you. But there's an entire class of people who are quite literally shafting the American worker to pay higher prices just to work in the city, because that's where all the jobs are, while these people can go off to the countryside, stay away from Google Maps, who don't have to deal with surveillance software, and they can basically get 10-foot hedges to basically block off their property. And you might think I'm being hyperbolic with this, saying that it's rich people that are taking over the countryside and forcing American workers into the city of these urban poverty traps so they can LARP as country boys on Twitter. Okay? But there is a documentary that I will be linking, because me and my wife were looking at Montana because we thought it was a pretty state and we wanted to move there and stuff like that. And I came across a documentary about an interesting migration of rich people that have been going into the state and driving up prices. They have been driving up prices so badly that the local population can't even live in the place that they grew up in. Is because rich people with remote work perms, or even asset owners, have been going up to Montana because it's a beautiful area, it's remote, and it's away from civilization, to buy up all the properties and jack up prices. Which is ironic, is because by the end of the video, they're complaining about the fact is they can't hire any minimum wage workers to give them the conveniences of civilization and their overpriced, property locations, right? It is a real effect that rich people are going to the countryside to drive up asset prices and displacing people who are originally living there into the city because they have no choice. Okay. And that's kind of the thing. The jobs in the countryside don't pay very well. That's why property prices are typically cheaper. But but rich people have noticed this fact, and they've taken advantage of it, and they're displacing people and forcing them into the countryside through these return to office policies, while they basically get to, continue working remote on their yacht or wherever they want. They get the flexibility, but everybody has to deal with. I'm going to start calling urban centers the wage cities, because that's what they are. They're just designed to be poverty traps to keep people eternally trapped in them, where everybody rents everything and everybody's spied on everybody, and we're all forced to work, for shit wages, while also paying premium prices for everything, while the rich live in the countryside getting paid loads of money while they get cheaper property prices. That is the dynamic of the people who are LARPing as a country on the internet these days. Okay? You might look at that and you might want to pull your hair out. You might almost start, you're probably getting really irritated at that fact, is because the fact is, I know every single person nowadays wants to be country these days, is because ultimately they just want to have their own plot of land and they want to be left alone. The reality is, the vast majority of people are never going to be able to attain that dream, and the only place where you're going to have a job just to get by, never enough to save enough money and leave, is going to be the city. Okay? And that's why I say, most people, when you're insulting city workers, people who live in major urban centers, okay, they're not privileged. Because if they were so privileged, why wouldn't you want to be living inside these major urban centers? Oh, that's right. You don't want to deal with the high crime, the high prices, and the high drug problems. That's the truth, okay? And so that's the fact. Those are the people who are stuck in the poverty trap of the urban center, honestly, probably have it infinitely worse. And that's the class dynamic that nobody talks about between the major cities and the countryside. And that might be controversial, but, at the end of the day, when you kind of realize it, that's what these cities are designed for. They're designed to be poverty traps to keep wages stuck in forever. Well, I think I made my point. It's not supposed to be a long video. I just kind of wanted to get my thoughts off on this one, is because at the end of the day, it's like, they want you living in the city so they can live out in the countryside, ignorance and bliss free of any kind of trouble, while you're always in survival mode, just making sure you pay rent. That's the insane thing. With that being said, what do you think? What do you think of all this? Do you think urban centers are poverty traps? Or do you think that there's a good side of the city? I grew up country, and so I prefer the country. Honestly, I'd love to move back to the country, but the thing is, there's not a lot of jobs out there. And so, you got to go where the money's at. But even in the city, there's jobs that exist there, but they don't pay that well anymore. I'm going to be honest with you. The only reason that me and my wife can get by is because we both work. That's the unfortunate truth. We're right at the 30% income mark. So that's how bad it is. And on top of that, it's like I was reading a Reddit post while I was at work today. I get paid just a little over 100 in the six figures, not much. Okay, I'm at the six figures and name only. Okay, and I was reading a post in 2017 where there were some computer science graduates talking about how they're getting 165K salaries upon graduation with the 50K sign-on bonus. And this was in 2017, mind you. This is when house prices were still under 300K. The average house price was under 300K. Imagine making 165 in an economy where the average house price is under 300K and $100 still fills up your grocery basket. Okay? That's the reality that people exist in now. The only reason I'm economically left is because the fact is I don't even make that money, and house prices have skyrocketed since then by 40%. So, with that being said, I think I've made my point. What do you think about this whole situation? I think the United States isn't getting any better, honestly. My advice is that if you haven't made it and you can't actually make it, like I said, if me and my wife lose a house, we're leaving the country. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We're not here to argue with, a group of people that quite literally don't want to change whatsoever. And I was watching another person's video, millennials theme. Most people are just going to bounce from this country if it gets too bad. There's no point in fighting this. If the United States wants to continue cannibalizing itself, I don't have much hope for this country. So the best thing you can do is just leave. Scrounge up enough money and just bounce out of the country. Hell, go to Northern Europe where at least they have social democratic policies. Or better yet, just get the fuck out of here and move to China. Because the United States sucks. There's nothing redeemable about this country, and it's just a ruling class that's cannibalizing itself and quite literally making everybody pay for it. It's ironic that, the only people who don't have to pay are rich people. That's the crazy thing. They always get a free pass. Even in COVID, they got a whole bunch of bailouts where everybody else had to risk losing their jobs. Again, it's like this system has a huge double standard. And the great thing about it is since the rest of the world's developing, just leave. There's no point in being here. People here, the ruling class ain't gonna listen. Boomers ain't gonna listen. So you might as well just bounce. With that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and close off the video. I think that's the third time I said that, but I think I made my point. Y'all have a good night. Peace.